Well, first of all, I would just like to start by congratulating Dr. Shereen for the nomination of the book Sex and the Citadel for the Orwell Book Award. We hope that we'll be celebrating soon the prize itself. I mean, and then I think it's a great honor, and it's well deserved, certainly. When I first started communicating with Shereen, I realized that her emails were not getting through, and I kind of found this strange, and it occurred to me to look into my spam email, and I found out that her emails were going to my spam email because it had the S word in it, Sex and the Citadel. So it is the clearest indication that even in our most advanced technological space, sex is seen as a problem. Sexuality is something that we should hide, spam away, and marginalized. We also do this physically with women and what we euphemistically call circumcision, which is actually the cutting and mutilation of women's genitals. We do this socially as well by blaming the victim of sexual violence and sexual harassment, that the women are the ones to blame, that they should be covered and also hidden away. So I mean, there's always this issue of sex and sexuality is seen as a problem that should be subjugated, marginalized, and hidden away, by all means, socially, physically, and even in the most advanced space of our modern world, technologically. So this is one of the things that we're going to touch upon, but I just want to start with you, Shereen, and ask you, what motivated you to write this book?
Sex and the Citadel stems from both my personal and my professional background, but just to be quite clear of what it took to write this book, I traveled 5 years across the Arab region from Morocco right through to Egypt, where I was based for much of that time, up through Mashrek and then over into the countries of the Gulf as well. I talk to people from all walks of life, men and women, young, old, rich, poor. I ask them about sex, what they do, what they don't, what they think, and why. Now, I know, depending on your perspective, this is going to sound like a dream job or possibly a highly dubious occupation. But for me, it stems from both my professional and my personal background. So, personally speaking, I am half Egyptian. But for those of you who are from the region will know something very interesting. So when I tell people I'm half Egyptian here, everyone says, fine, one parent, your father is Egyptian, your mother is Welsh. When I say the same statement in Egypt, they say to me, oh, your mother is Egyptian. And I said, no, my father is Egyptian. And they say, well, inti masriya khalis. I mean, you must be 100% Egyptian if your father is Egyptian. So that speaks whole volumes about the status of men and women. I am Muslim. Most of my family live in Egypt and the wider Arab world, but I was brought up in Canada, very far from my Arab roots, and I never really thought about these connections to the Middle East until September 11th. And it was the tragic events of that day that really prompted me to try to learn more about where I came from. Who are these people? What are my roots? Now, the fact I chose sex as my lens is a little unusual. But that comes from my professional training. I studied to be an immunologist, and my first job at The Economist magazine was as healthcare correspondent. And part of my responsibility was writing about the global HIV/AIDS epidemic, and I became very interested in what was happening around HIV in the Arab region. Now, most people will tell you we don't have HIV in the Arab world, and it's very true that we have very low rates of HIV across the general population. But in very specific groups of people who are at high risk, we have rates 10% and above. And in fact, there are only 2 parts of the world in which HIV is still on the rise in terms of new infections and AIDS-related deaths. And I have news for you. The Middle East and North Africa is one of those 2 regions. We are on the curve of HIV. If you want to understand HIV in the Arab region, you need to talk about sex, because the vast majority of cases in most of our countries are sexually transmitted, and all the taboos around sex are a huge obstacle to really rising to the challenge of HIV. So under the sort of the guise of HIV, putting on my white coat of public health to give me respectability, I managed to knock on doors and to get people to start talking about sex. But once I got in the door, I took off my white coat and started to really talk about sexuality. And this is what became very interesting to me, because I realized very quickly that what was happening inside the bedroom is actually connected to what's happening outside in politics and economics and religion and tradition and relations between gender and generations. And that's why I say in the book that if you really want to know a people, you start by looking inside their bedrooms. And that's exactly what I did and what I continue to do in my current work.
Shereen, I'm curious, why did you use the Citadel as a metaphor in your book?
It's a very good question. It's very hard for me to see you out there, the vast numbers who are in attendance. But raise your hand if you have been to Cairo. Ah, fantastic. Wow. Please come on back. We need your tourist dollars. Okay, raise your hand if you have visited the Citadel. Ah, an impressive showing. Okay, for those of you who have not yet had the opportunity to do so, the Citadel is a fortress. It was built by Salahuddin, the great crusader crusher. It dominates, or used to dominate, the landscape in eastern Cairo. It is a generic term, however, for an impregnable fortress. And I use it as a metaphor to talk about sex in the Arab region. The only socially accepted context for sexual activity in Egypt and its neighbors. And I need to just pause here to say that I am tending to generalize in my discussion. We were talking about 370 million people in the Arab region and huge diversity between countries and within countries. So pardon me when I use shorthand here. But generally speaking, the only socially accepted context for sexual activity is marriage. And it's not any old marriage. It has to be approved by your family. It has to be approved by religion. And it has to be registered by the state. And any activity outside of that is haram, it's forbidden, it's aib, it's shameful, it's adab, it's impolite. We have this endless lexicon of reproof in Arabic. The problem today is that at any given time, there are large portions of the population which no longer fit inside the Citadel. And among them are the vast numbers of young people. As you know, we have a huge youth bulge in the Arab region. 60% or more of the populations in any country in the region are under the age of 30. And those young people in particular young men, are finding it very hard to get married within the old framework. The age of marriage is rapidly rising. In Tunisia, for example, the average age of marriage is around early 30s for men. It's now late 20s for women. And part of the reason for this is economics. Men are expected to bear the costs of marriage from the big white wedding and beyond, but we have such high rates of unemployment in our region, particularly for young people, that they can't afford to get married. Now, in both Islam and Christianity, as you know, we are enjoined to remain chaste before marriage. And indeed, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, suggested that in order to remain chaste, that we fast. But he was not talking about fasting until your 30s. So the real issue for if you can't get married, this is true for men, but it's particularly true for women. If you can't get married, you can't move out of your parents' place. You're not supposed to be having sex, and you're definitely not supposed to be having children. You enter into what could best be described as a state of suspended adolescence. How do you exercise your right, your sexual rights? And so these are just one of the groups of people who are outside the Citadel, and we need to find a way to accommodate these individuals, because when we choose to ignore the fact that sexual activity is happening outside the context of marriage, this is when all the problems come in, including a rising tide of HIV, AIDS, and sexually transmitted infections.
Well, I'm glad, you brought out this perspective, because, as I mentioned at the beginning, the starting point of talking about sex and sexuality is always putting sex as a problem, as an issue that we have to get rid of. I gave 3 examples at the beginning. I also remember when I was doing my doctorate in England at Sussex, I remember that how there was a high criticism of how the discourse of addressing the issues of sexuality in the space of the United Nations and the development world was always, again, starting from the issue of sexuality as a problem. How did you address this in your book, and how do you think, we can surpass that?
Well, it's very true that, and this is not unique to the Arab region, as you point out, that across the global south, one really finds that the public discourse around sex is to problematize sex. And as you say, you gave examples, it's sex as a disease, HIV/AIDS, it's sex as an exploitation, trafficking, for example, it's sex as a violation of human rights. It's never sex as a source of creativity and a source of vitality and a source of positive development. What's interesting is if we look back at the long history of writing about sex, and this is absolutely fascinating because this history is often overlooked in our region, but long before the liberal West was talking openly about sex, in the Arab world, we had a very robust tradition about writing at sex in a very free and frank and for the day, quite scientific manner. I mean, I'm telling you that there is nothing in the joy of sex or cosmopolitan, any taboo-busting work of the sexual revolution, or even, dare I suggest, 50 Shades of Grey, that they were not writing about 1,000 years ago in Baghdad. And what's interesting about that writing, this historical writing, is that most of it was done by religious scholars. These are men of Islam who saw nothing incompatible between the needs of the faith and the needs of the flesh. And this writing in particular is amazing because it talks not just about sex as a problem, but it talks about sex as a God-given source of pleasure, and not just for men, but also for women. Can I just give our audience a flavor of what what that writing sounds like? So in the book, I quote a lot of these historical examples of the writing about sex. And this is not because I'm some sort of sexual Salafi here. I am not suggesting we return to some mythical golden age of sexual liberality. But what I am interested in seeing is that for their time, our ancestors had a way of talking about sex that made sense for their age. And that we need to really rediscover that spirit. And we need to do more than just say no when, as you say, in the United Nations, there are moves on trying to progress sexual and reproductive rights. We need to come up with a positive framework of thinking about sex that makes sense for our culture and our time. And the book I refer to time and again in Sex and the Citadel is called Jawami al-Ladha. It's the Encyclopedia of Pleasure, and it was written in the about the 10th or 11th century. It came out of Baghdad. The book is really amazing. I mean, it has 43 chapters. They cover every conceivable sexual practice: heterosexual, homosexual, male and female, bisexual, animal, vegetable, mineral, you name it. It's all there. The author's message is clear: sex is God's gift to mankind, and we are meant to enjoy it. While the book's intent is serious, its style is not only arousing, but very often hilarious. I attracted plenty of dirty looks from fellow readers in a rare book room of one London library as I squirmed and guffawed my way through stories like this. Now, this is a passage taken from the Encyclopedia of Pleasure. And it's talking about a woman who lived in Medina around the time of the birth of Islam. Huba al-Madaniya, for instance, said that one day she went out of the bath accompanied by a boy who had a puppy. It so happened that the puppy, seeing her vulva and vaginal lips, went between her legs and began to lick her organ. She lowered her body to give the animal a better chance of performing its job. However, when she had reached an orgasm, she fell down heavily upon it and could not raise herself until the helpless animal had died from heavy pressure. Okay, so my apologies to animal lovers in the audience. But the point here is that sex is something to be celebrated. Yes, okay, it's supposed to be within the context of marriage. Okay, we have these regulated structures. Okay, that's the theory. Let's talk about practice. What's really happening? And that is the spirit that I am hoping that Sex and the Citadel will stimulate people to think again about why have we made sex into a problem instead of talking about it as a pleasure.
Well, it's a little bit dark here, but I can tell that I can see some faces blushing as you read what your phrases. And I was just like thinking about your research process itself and your methodology. I mean, like, sex is a taboo in generally, but more so in the Arab world and the Middle East. How did you manage to get your people, your interviewees, to open up and speak, I mean, frankly about these issues? I mean, and address, I mean, their concerns, I mean, like, be open about it?
My problem was not getting people to talk about sex, it was getting them to stop talking about sex, quite frankly. And that's because in Egypt and many other countries and communities in our region, it's not that people don't talk about sex. Women talk to women about sex all the time, and men are speaking to men. The reticence, the hesitation comes in when you mix men and women, and that's even within the context of marriage, our socially accepted setting for sex, and I talk about this in the book. And then when you try to take this discourse public, whether it's in the media or in government policy or in religious discourse, I had the advantage of a number of points. One, because my opening gambit, if you like, was to talk about public health. And HIV, although it can be a limiting discourse, is a very valuable way to come to topics that we simply couldn't talk about 10 years ago. I, for example, have participated in workshops where we brought together religious leaders, Christian, Sunni and Shia, but also men who have sex with men. Impossible to have brought them to the table if we had just sat down and said we want to talk about sexual rights. But possible if you problematize it and talk about public health. So there was that asset. But quite frankly, at the end of the day, it was really my insider-outsider status. So because I am Egyptian, because I am Muslim, and because I speak what could best be described as idiosyncratic Arabic, women were very open to speaking to me because they felt I knew where they were coming from. Of course, I look like a complete Khawageya. I mean, I look like my Welsh mother. And that actually was an advantage as well, because just as people in the West have ideas about sexual practices and attitudes in the Arab region, which my book tries to shed light and nuance on, people in the region also have stereotypes about sexual life in the West. And one of those stereotypes is that basically the West is a sexual free-for-all and anything goes. And that was a huge advantage because very often women who are concerned about maintaining appearances, being seen to be good women, and are embarrassed to talk about these matters, felt much more comfortable talking to me because they thought, here is someone who comes from a place where sex can be discussed without censure and without judgment. So what could have been the worst of both worlds actually turned out to be the best. And not just from a professional standpoint, it allowed me to write the book, but from a personal standpoint, I used this process to really reconnect with the region. And I haven't felt as welcome, or I haven't laughed so much, quite frankly, as the 5 years that people spoke to me so intimately about their lives, and for that I am truly grateful to all the people who shared their experiences with me.
Thank you so much, Shereen. I mean, like, I have a confession. It was actually when I first read the title of your book, and it's like I said, here is another Orientalist view about the Arab world and the traditional, conventional views. And I was like pleasantly surprised that it's totally not actually like that, and it's totally not what we've seen in the press in the recent days about Alice in Arabia. Thankfully, this was put on hold because of the launching of several criticism for such approach. And I'm just curious, why is Egypt the focus of your book? I mean, like, you give a historical context to the issue, and you also talk broadly about the Arab world and the Middle East. I mean, like, well, why did you focus in Egypt?
Again, the reasons were partly personal. It's because of my personal connection to Egypt, largely because I grew up hearing of my father's exploits when he was a young man in the 50s in Egypt, and I would compare them to what I knew of how my cousins and my relatives are living today as young men, but in particular as young women. And just the contrast of how in my father's generation, they seem to be much more at ease in their sexual skin than we are today. And I began to wonder, well, what's happened? How have things changed? I also grew up hearing the proverbs, the amthal of my grandmother, which I can only describe as fully frontal. My grandmother came from El Rif. I mean, she came from a village in the Delta, and my father would relay these proverbs to me, and they're in the book. They start most chapters. I mean, one of her most memorable proverbs is Madame Baïd Tizi Khalas. So long as it's away from my ass, it's okay. And I need to point out she was not talking about the village donkey either. And the reason she would say that is actually, she's talking about privacy. Okay, what you do behind closed doors is your own business, a very important principle in Islam, and actually a very interesting point that was brought up to me time and time again by LGBTQ activists in the region, and how they were looking for accommodation in the current cultural climate. So Egypt for personal reasons, but also, as you know better than do I, because you look at Egypt in the geopolitical context. Egypt has enormous power within the Arab region. It has considerable soft power, to be sure, through movies and music and soap operas and the like. Certainly Egyptians spread throughout the region, particularly the Gulf. So it's very interesting to see trends that occur in Egypt have a real impact elsewhere in the region. What's fascinating is when I started researching this book in 2007, 2008, Egypt had essentially lost the plot, quite frankly, and it was seen as a lost cause of dictatorship, authoritarianism, and Islamism, and poverty, and crumbling infrastructure, and corruption. And quite frankly, all this was summed up for me beautifully by a taxi driver in Rabat. I was speaking to him, and he learned that I had just come from Cairo. And he said to me, "Egyptians, so egotistical, and for what?" And what's interesting is that since 2011, and even now with all the twists and turns we're taking on the scenic route to democracy, Egypt still has considerable influence within the region. People are looking to Egypt to see how things will pan out in what is the most populous country in the Arab region. Egypt matters, and for that reason as well, it made sense to focus the book on Egypt.
Interesting. Well, I mean, I want to move to the idea of conservatism in Egypt and in the Arab world, and the sources of that. Where does this come from? And I want to read a paragraph from your book, actually, when you're referring to Sayyid Qutb, who's actually one of the most inspiring figures for particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, but also conservative Islam in general. You say in the book, I mean, Qutb's framing of the West as a cesspit of sexual chaos and moral decay, a sort of reverse Orientalism, is echoed in the rhetoric of many Islamic conservatives today. To guard against such contamination, Qutb argued, Muslim societies must go back to the ways of the founding fathers of Islam, the Salaf, or rather, an interpretation of the time of the Prophet. I mean, how far do you see, such interpretation or influence, impact the way sex and sexuality and ultimately also sexual violence in the region, play out?
It's certainly the rise of Islamic fundamentalism since the late 1970s has profoundly shaped Egypt, and you only have to go out on the streets and see that 90% of women today wear hijab. To see just one manifestation of that. I need to point out that essentially conservatives the world over, and they don't have to be Islamic conservatives, they can be Christian conservatives of most faiths, use sex wrapped up in religion as a very powerful tool of social control. And quite frankly, you don't actually have to be a member, a card-carrying member of the Ikhwan or indeed a Salafi to espouse these very conservative ideas. We only have to look at our transitional military government in Egypt to see that sex is also used as a weapon, and particularly against women. And certainly when I interviewed young people in Egypt and the wider Arab world, and there's a whole chapter on the travails they experience it's a chapter called Sex and the Single Arab, they would, many of them would lament the rise of conservatism and say, well, what happened to Egypt? What happened to our beautiful culture? What happened to literature? What happened to what they perceived as a greater openness around all issues, not just around sex, but politics and economics and cultural thought? What happened? And they would blame it largely on the rise of fundamentalism. We need to keep in mind, of course, we had this homegrown movement with the growth of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, but there is an additional force which has come through the power of the Gulf, and in particular the power of Saudi Arabia, also since the early 70s and the oil boom. And that, of course, has brought a different strain of Islamic conservatism to Egypt and many of its neighbors, a much more sort of austere Wahhabi in interpretation of Islam, and the dynamic driving that is different to Egypt, but certainly pronounced. So yes, I would say that it has very much colored the way certainly gender roles are defined in Egypt and many of its neighbors, and also sort of the framing of sexuality. And what is troubling for me is that sexual rights in particular have been defined as a Western construct. It's very interesting. Last year, around some of the debates at the Commission on the Status of Women in the United Nations, the Muslim Brotherhood issued what could only be described as a positively hysterical statement, suggesting that any move on any aspect of sexual or reproductive rights is the slippery slope to the complete dissolution of Arab and Islamic society. And again, it's because we don't have our own definitions of this. And there's not enough mental space for most people to think about how we could find flexibility around sexuality and gender roles, even within the context of Islam. And that's one of the things I call for in my book. We need to be exercising ijtihad. We need to be exercising our duty as Muslims to think through what is possible within our age. I think what is interesting now, and that's sort of looking at the past, but it's really looking forward in the future, and with the rise and dramatic fall of the Muslim Brotherhood, what is this going to mean for the Islamic discourse, and therefore the popular and public discourse and private behaviors and thinking around gender roles and sexuality? And that's an open question, and we will see as the years go by.
Right. Shereen, I mean, I think your research didn't stop at the publication of the book, and you also have the live space. I mean, like on the internet, you have the website, I mean, Sex and the Citadel. And do you think there is a trend of a pushback against all these, I mean, traditions? And is the rise of sexual violence, sexual harassment that we're seeing, like, is becoming an endemic right now, is this a sort of a resistance to this pushback?
Sexual violence is not at the end of the day about sex. It's about power, quite frankly. And if we look at the example of Egypt, we are looking at what remains an authoritarian power structure. And men have their place in the patriarchy. Now, I need to point out that the patriarchy is great for men at the top of the pyramid. It's not so great for men down below. And if you want to know how difficult it is to be a man in the Arab world today, you only need to look at Mohamed Bouazizi, the poor Tunisian vegetable seller who was prevented from peddling his wares. And at the end of the day, the only power that remained to him was to set himself on fire. That's all that remained. That's how disenfranchised and desperate this young man was. It's definitely not easy being a woman, as we know from personal experience and also all the research, but it's not all that great being a man either. And here in the audience, I have colleagues from a fantastic NGO called Promundo, and Promundo works with men, and particularly on men and gender-based violence. And Promundo has done some fantastic work on surveying men around the world. This is a project called Images, and this is a project of studying men, which we're planning to bring to the Arab region. And so one of the issues around sexual violence is that we know from Images research and others that when you put men under pressure, they behave badly. And if they're in an authoritarian power structure, the next people down the line in the power chain they behave badly to are women. And so it's very important to sort of unpack, why do men do what they do? What is really driving their behaviors? And for example, most of the documentaries we've had, and indeed the research we've had, is talked to women about sexual violence, hasn't really sat down with men and explored, why are they doing this? And so I think a lot needs to change, not just for women, but also for men, to reduce the incidence of sexual violence in Egypt. I think what's interesting, however, is that the downside is that we are seeing an explosion of this violence. The upside, however, is that we are now seeing a pushback. We are seeing resistance. So when I started this book 5-6 years ago, no woman would speak out publicly about being sexually harassed, let alone being raped. And of course, in the wake of the tragic events of Tahrir Square last year, where we saw these sort of organized, politically motivated assaults on women, you at least see a few women, not all women, but a few women speaking out. And what's most interesting is that you see men standing alongside them. Not all men, but some men, saying that this is completely unacceptable and it is a woman's right to be in the public place. And this is a very small step forward out of what is a really very difficult situation. And so, you know, Nancy, we have these what we call the red lines in the. I mean, why don't you explain to people the three red lines? Because you've crossed these lines yourself with dramatic effect.
Well, yeah, of course. Politics, religion, and sex. So,
yes, and not necessarily politics, religion, and sex in that order. But as Nancy knows, and Nancy's at the forefront of this, and the red line of politics has been well and truly crossed since 2011 in many of our countries, even as authorities push back. The red line of religion. One of the useful aspects of the rise to power of the Islamic conservatives in recent years has been that people have been asking these hard questions about religion. What is the role of Islam in public life, for example? Who speaks for Islam? Well, the third red line is, as you say, sex, and at least around some aspects, in particular sexual violence. We're starting to see discussions around coercion, early marriage, for example, nibbling at the edges of sexual discrimination. We are starting to see some movement, but at the end of the day, we need to be realistic in our expectations of the pace of change. And in this book, I never talk about revolution. I talk about evolution, and that's because change takes time in our region.
I want to get your reactions on two issues. Basically, they're kind of related, and you mentioned it is like the need to get men to engage in this whole discourse and the whole issue. I mean, like a quick glance at the audience here is predominantly women. I mean, and we're in DC in the U.S., the most open and more progressive than what we compare to in the book. How do we get to encourage or motivate men to become part of this, I mean, conversation and to realize that this is a problem of the society? And the other part of my question is that how do we just go beyond the systematic kind of procedural way of engaging women for merely putting quotas to include women in parliament, or open the space and invite women to participate in public lives? I mean, as you pointed out personally, I mean, when I was doing my job, and even when I was prosecuted, the first thing I was threatened and intimidated upon by the prosecutor is just by me, not as a political activist, but as a woman and as a mother. So, I mean, how do we, get men engaged in these issues, and how do we surpass this traditional, conventional way of just putting a quota and including women, or inviting women as this is a space for everyone, without removing the burial structural hindrance for the participation of women and feel safe about it?
So it's going to be the work of a generation, and I think actually we're looking at lost generations now. So in a sense, we need to start looking at children, quite frankly, and how we are bringing them up. And what was interesting is actually when I spoke to protesters in Tahrir Square in the tumultuous years of 2011 and 2012, many of these young people I spoke to talked as if the uprising had passed them by, that any of the hopes that they had for a better future was too late for them, that maybe their children would experience it. And so it does rely on education, but I would say at the end of the day, it's actually going to be education not in the classroom, but education in the family room. And key to changing these attitudes and getting women fully engaged, and also men learning to embrace a greater parity between men and women, is quite frankly how mothers are raising their sons. If we look at the average Egyptian household, and again I am generalizing here, if you raise your son to be a little prince and your daughters are serving your son, if your son can wander widely in the world, yet your daughters have to stay at home because we are afraid that they might somehow damage their hymens and therefore not be virgins on their wedding night, a problem, a grave source of concern for both individuals and families, which I discuss at length in the book. If men are allowed, your boys are allowed to roam the internet freely, and yet your girls have to stay at home, look at the internet, if you have a family computer, under the watchful eye of brothers and uncles and relatives, this is how the inequality starts. It gets fostered in schools. It continues in the workplace for the minority of Egyptian women, for example, who actually do have jobs, a big issue. And then it perpetuates in marriage. So it's going to start in the household, quite frankly. In terms of, can we wait that long? No, we can't. So what are we going to do in the meantime? In terms of practically how we engage men in these discussions, this is something which we are exploring now in this new project, Images MENA. And I'm actually, hopefully in the Q&A, I can defer to my colleagues from Promundo, because they have vast experience in how do you engage men in cultures which are male-dominated, machismo, and heavily patriarchal. We don't really have that experience. I can count on one hand the number of civil society groups in the entire Arab region which focus specifically on men and gender-based violence and domestic and intimate life. We need to build that civil society, and part of the problem, even within government, when governments think about gender empowerment, gender has a female face, basically, in our region, and men have been left out of the equation. Again, it comes back to the fact that we tend to problematize sex and reproduction. It's always, when it's a problem, it's always women as the victims and men as the perpetrators. They're part of the problem. We haven't seen them as part of the solution. Changing that paradigm is going to start with a lot of work, and part of that work will be understanding what on earth do men want and what do men think. And strangely enough, men are the elephant in the room. They are the pillars of the patriarchy, but we actually know very little about how they see their roles as fathers and as husbands and as sons, and really understanding how they feel about women's empowerment. Because very much when we have polling data, I can tell you that polling data just came out yesterday from Afrobarometer. This surveys men and women, thousands and thousands across all of sub-Saharan Africa, including North Africa. And it's very interesting that we have some fairly expected results around gender roles. And when they asked the questions in North Africa, they found the most conservative attitudes. When you asked the classic question, can a woman be a president or a leader of a country? When they asked this question in sub-Saharan Africa, they had strong minorities of men in many countries saying it's not possible to have a woman as a leader, and majorities of women disagreeing with that statement, that of course it is possible, except when we get to North Africa, including Egypt, in which strong majorities of men think that it's not possible for a woman to be a leader, or no country should be led by a woman. But also what's interesting is that strong numbers of women also agreed with that statement. So the patriarchy is going to take a very, very long time to dismantle, quite frankly. And this is not unique to the Arab region. This is across the world, including, dare I suggest, America as well, where, you know, depending on where you look, the patriarchy is alive, perhaps not kicking quite as vigorously as it does in the Arab region. So again, things take time. But certainly we are starting to see a questioning about some of these very entrenched, or what seemingly entrenched attitudes that we never saw during the long years of Mubarak or Ben Ali or the other dictators.
Thank you so much, Shereen. And I'm sure, I mean, like, I don't want to hijack the conversation, because I'm sure our guests are very eager to ask you some question. But I have just one last question. I mean, like, at the Tahrir Institute, we are committed to bring, I mean, the marginalized voices to the policy circles. I mean, like, let them be heard. And I don't know how far do you think that the current, I mean, like, news spaces of, like, the social media and the internet, I mean, create this bridge or new space for people to address these issues openly? I mean, have they helped? Or is it just a superficial kind of change that did not really affect those, like, power relations that occur between, like, men and women and the issues of sexual violence and onward?
As in anywhere in the world, the internet is both a boon and a bane when it comes to looking at issues of gender relations and sexuality. And I certainly, from my observation in the Arab region, the internet, and particularly social media, can be extremely powerful in changing young people's attitudes and also providing them information. This is particularly true for men and women who have sex with their own sex. The terminology we would use in the West is, or international speak, is LGBTQ. I don't use that terminology much in the book, because while there are most certainly men and women who do self-identify as gay or lesbian or queer in much of the Arab region, I have met many people who have sex with their own sex and would never dream of thinking of themselves that way, although they fully understand what gay and lesbian and the like means. And also for people with different gender identity. Certainly the internet is an amazing resource for those who do have access to it. It's a real antidote to the fire and brimstone that you will find on most websites, because of course, just as those who are trying to promote progressive and accurate messaging around sexuality have a place on the internet, there's also a place for those who are preaching really quite regressive and conservative interpretations. In particular for women who have sex with other women, the internet is an amazing opportunity. Men who have sex with men in most of our countries, even if their behaviors are penalized or criminalized under the law, and they're subjected to huge amounts of opprobrium, whether it's from the family or religious discourse, nonetheless, they are men, whether they are gay or straight. And therefore, they can go out and they can meet other men. This is not true for women, irrespective of their sexual preferences. And so women are often very isolated, have restricted mobility. And therefore, the internet for them is just an amazing way to not only get information, but also to meet other women. I'd just like to highlight one amazing development, which actually came earlier this month for our region. There is a new website called Hub Thaqafa, so love culture. And this is a new website which is based in part in the Netherlands, but also with a team in Egypt. And it's providing the most amazing information about sex and relationships. It's extraordinary. They have a Facebook site. They're getting hundreds of thousands of young people from across the region visiting it. And it's really one of the great sort of elements of progress I can point to in terms of starting to shift ideas and attitudes and really finding our own voice in terms of talking about sex. So that's all the positive side. The downside is that, of course, we have this highly religious, conservative discourse, which can be very unhelpful. But also, frankly, the other extreme is pornography. You know, there is a lot of porn going down in Egypt and much of the Arab region, and it has really detrimental effects on relationships as it does anywhere in the world. And in the book, I talk about going to visit a woman who does amal, who does magic, basically. Very popular even amongst educated people in Egypt, the idea that you would perhaps get a talisman, hijab, to keep your husband from wandering. And actually, the woman very kindly offered me one as well, but at the time I was engaged, and so I knew that I had ways to keep my fiance in line. But anyway, it was very interesting in talking to her, and again, this is not a highly educated woman, but like almost all the people I spoke to in the Arab region, they all had these incredibly insightful and intelligent things to say, even the poorest, least educated people. But she said, look, the porn is having a huge effect. Women are under pressure. Their husbands are watching these videos. They want to have, in particular, anal or oral sex. Their wives feel that this is unacceptable, this is improper. Although, interestingly, we do have fatwa on certainly oral sex, which the Sheikh al-Qaradawi, who used to be a highly influential Islamic voice in the Arab region, said was permissible, but potentially blameworthy. There's a nod to that there. And of course, we have a very lively debate in some Islamic circles as to the permissibility of anal sex. And for those of you who are not aware, I have to tell you that we actually have hadiths on anal sex, and this was a matter of extreme interest to the early Muslim community. So if they could talk about it openly then, why can't we broach it openly now? But in any case, this hairdresser, this woman who was doing magic, was saying, I keep telling women feel that sex is a shame, and they're feeling under pressure from the pornography. And she said, on the other hand, their husbands, they want to have livelier sex lives. And yet, when their wives try to show some spark in the bedroom, they are horrified. Some of these men are horrified. So the pornography is causing a lot of tension as well within marriages and also within men. And that's the downside. So again, both a force for good and a force for problems as well.
Well, this certainly opened a huge side of the debate about how far public governance, have control over private life. And this control, has manifested in different tools, through religion, through politics, and through economics even as well. And it's I think we can continue this conversation, for days and days. But I just want to give an opportunity to our guests. If they want to ask questions for Shereen, there's a microphone that's going to be floating around. Anyone who wants to have a question, just introduce yourself and where you're from. There's one over here, I can see.
Hi, thank you very much for a very fascinating talk and, very well-researched kind of book on, changing attitudes towards sex or not in the Middle East. I'm someone who's interested in the past. I'm a historian myself, and was very pleased to see you kind of tapping into the rich pre-modern literature and heritage in the Islamic world and the Middle East. And I was wondering what you think happened to that, because as you were saying and as the sources indicate, sex and sexuality was something that was it was varied, it was diverse and multivalent, and very much, considered natural, organic, and of course pleasurable. What happened to that attitude toward the body, toward sexuality, toward sex as something that was, as you said, a God-given right to pleasure? And the other thing that I wanted to ask about was whether or not you discuss or what you think of the connection that a lot of women's historians have made about the relationship between modernization and conservatism in society, whether you want to call it Salafi, Muslim Brotherhood, what have you. To what extent has modernization enabled or made inevitable a turn to a much kind of flatter, much more rigid understanding of morality, and to what extent has that impacted this otherwise very elastic sense of sexuality that existed in the pre-modern period?
Do you want to take one or two questions? Or
Yeah, maybe we can take another question and then answer them. I can't see who's in the audience. Yeah, there's another question over there.
Thank you, Shereen. You're amazing.
Thank you. I wish I could see the both of you, your fantastic
okay.
questions, and thank you for the feedback.
Thank you, Shereen. You're phenomenal. When will LGBT rights actually become a real issue, like on the agenda that people can address in a legitimate way? I mean, not a hidden agenda, not, you know, we'll deal with women's rights first, we'll deal with this first, we'll deal with that first.
Great, thank you.
How can we get that on the agenda? To it be like right here and right now.
Okay, let's get those two questions, and then we're gonna move on to other questions.
So in terms of the history, I feel that I should defer to you as a historian, really, quite frankly, because again, the winding down around sex is part of a wider closing down, basically. And this is not a unique observation. Certainly a number of historians and anthropologists and sociologists have remarked that the Abbasid period, again, you know, going way back, it was a climax of sort of political and economic and cultural power, a golden age as we look at it now. And of course, sex was part of that. And that the winding down around sex is certainly part and parcel of a winding down around all domains, and that's a very long historical process, and I certainly would defer to you on talking about the intricacies of that. What I think is interesting in looking in terms of this writing, the erotica, is that it essentially dries up around the 19th century, and it's not a coincidence that that is the period of European colonization of many countries in the Arab region. And again, a number of historians have remarked that part of this winding down may come from the fact that the elites within the region who were in closest contact with the European colonizers start to see themselves through European eyes. And the prevailing discourse at that time is one of disdain for the sexed up aspects of Middle Eastern society. I mean, this is what's very interesting. And in the book I call it Trading Places. That we go from a period in which the Arab world was seen as completely licentious. And indeed, it's quite interesting to read the early Christian commentary on the emergence of Islam. And one of the criticisms they would make, particularly of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is that how can this man possibly be a messenger of God? He is so sexed up. He is talking about sex all the time, and with good reason, because Islam is not in its essence anti-sex. And of course, we fast forward to the 21st century, where again the West is seen as some sort of radiating source of sexual debauchery, and the Arab region is seen as entirely buttoned up. And the inflection point appears to be in the 19th century. And this is not unique to the Arab region, because we see an analogous process going on in other parts of the world which were colonized. India is a very good example, and indeed much of the legislation that is a source of debate in India today, like Section 377, the anti-sodomy law, that is a product of colonization. And so this is a very sort of simplistic answer to someone who knows the history chapter and verse, but it is that period of colonization which in part starts to shift the discourse, and at least the closing down around the writings on sexuality. And this very much gains ground with the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood, at least in Egypt, in the early part of the 20th century. In terms of the connection between modernization and the rise of fundamentalism and more conservative interpretations around Islam, and I'm going to speak specifically here about Egypt because the dynamic is different in different countries, I would say certainly it has gained ground in large part as a response to dictatorship, quite frankly. I mean, I think that one of the reasons, certainly in recent decades, that the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, gained such a following is because, quite frankly, they offered the only form of political engagement during the long years, certainly of the Mubarak regime, And quite frankly, they provided essential services, healthcare, education, sanitation, transportation, you name it, that the state simply couldn't be bothered to provide. So there is an element of that. But it's a really interesting question, because I would also argue that the impact of modernization and economics and globalization and the infitah policy in Egypt, which we saw from the time of Sadat, the opening of the economy to the full force of global capitalism, has, I think, in a very interesting way, also fed fundamentalism, in part because it opened young people to a whole world of possibilities that they could never actually afford, because the state didn't think about how we could actually create jobs and give people a real economic stake in society. So I think, again, it's a very complex question, but certainly I would hold that, yes, Egypt gives a very interesting illustration of that. Sorry, I can't hear you. You're the expert. Please be my guest.
On the issue of modernization, I guess what I meant to say is that a lot of women's historians and others have argued that the rise of conservative attitudes and, for example, the veiling of women in places like Egypt or other parts of the Arab world has to do, in fact, with modernization. In other words,
modernization, how defined as what?
Defined as women being educated and going out to work, and as a means of kind of retaining. The hijab has often been, or hijab has often been portrayed or represented, right, as a means by which women are empowered in the public sphere, which they have entered as a result of modernization. Sorry.
Sure, although we need to keep in mind, I mean, women, one of the anomalies of our region is women are increasingly educated but not increasingly employed. So we have only 25% female labor force participation rates in Egypt. It is interesting, and then women, yes, have adopted that in part as almost like a patriarchal, it's almost in a sense a patriarchal bargain I put on the hijab. It buys me greater scope, quite frankly. And I see this anecdotally. You can see this amongst young women in Cairo. Any of you who have been to Cairo in recent years have seen that 90% of young women under age 30 cover their hair. But what's interesting is that on the surface, it's quite interesting that on the one hand that they are adhering to conservative Islamic codes. But the question is, well, how do they do that? So yes, they do cover their hair. They cover their aura. So they cover the parts of the body which, according to their interpretation, should not be on public display. So the head is covered, they wear something down to their wrists and then down to their ankles. But how do they do it? Okay, so the hijab is like this fantastical headscarf arrangement. It's like a bird of paradise landed on their heads. What it does is attract the eye. They're wearing some of the most extraordinarily high heels. Again, anyone who has ever walked on the sidewalks of Cairo will know that these girls are taking their lives into their hands. It's just not safe to walk with heels this high. They're wearing skin-tight jeans, and they've got these little polo necks. But then they're wearing tunics, and the tunics are made out of lycra, and lycra is God's gift to Arab men. So what I mean by this, and again, it's a very superficial example, and I'm sorry, because your question is very profound, but nonetheless, women are both conforming to Islamic codes, but they're also subverting them at the same time. And what's interesting is that there is a long tradition of this. My grandmother used to do this as well. It just takes different forms in different ages. But I'd be delighted to talk at greater length about that particular point, because it's really interesting. On the subject of LGBTQ, so at the moment across the region, I'd say we have about a dozen groups that are actively engaged in some fashion in terms of largely support groups, information groups for individuals who self-identify as LGBTQ. They are a minority of a minority in terms of people who have sex with their own sex or indeed have a different gender identity. I spent a long time interviewing these groups, and the hotbed for this sort of thinking is in Lebanon. And what was absolutely fascinating in talking to some of these incredibly intelligent and informed LGBTQ activists is that they knew the history of the gay rights movement in the West, chapter and verse. and yet they could tell you with devastating clarity and cogence why they thought it wasn't going to work in their part of the world and why they didn't want this. And it's not just because of entrenched attitudes towards homosexuality, particularly male homosexuality. It's because, as they argued quite rightly, what is the point of achieving rights for a minority when the majority of people are completely disenfranchised? We have to work on a much broader base. We have to form alliances with other groups. And it really came home to me, and it really brought out what's a really interesting question about sexual freedom. And this is a question I'm often asked, often by journalists, particularly in Europe, how can one achieve sexual freedom in an Islamic context? And the point I always make is that sexual freedom is actually a relative term. How you define freedom in many European countries, for example, is different to how young people or individuals in the Arab region define it. And for example, to give you the instance of LGBTQ, I interviewed some really fantastic queer activists in the region, and they said, look, we're not looking for the freedom to come out. That is of no interest to us. We are looking for the freedom to stay in and do as we choose in the privacy of our own homes. And if I can just quote one young man who's actually a friend. He's a poor gay man in Cairo. And I have to tell you, although in Egypt we don't have a law which explicitly criminalizes male sodomy, nonetheless poor gay men are routinely picked up and subjected to all sorts of violations of human rights, abuses. The anal exam is hugely popular with CSI Cairo to try to demonstrate, allegedly demonstrate homosexual practice. So this man who had been raped by the police, had been unjustly arrested, had the full force of the anal exam. I asked him, what would you really like to see in future? What is the change that you aspire to? And he said, I want my rights, but only within the framework of Egyptian and Eastern society and Islam. The rights are that I should not understand democracy or freedom in a wrong way. Go and kiss a man in the street? No, this is an Islamic country. I, as a gay man, I don't want to see this. If I go for this gay pride, what am I really asking for? And then he answered his own question. I want respect. That's all I ask for. Respect for me as a human, not because I am gay. And that is the emerging thinking of the smartest people working on these issues, to actually try to base the greater rights for sexual minorities in the broader context of ethnic and religious and racial minorities, but also in the context of the fact that we have a disenfranchised population generally, and for all our fantastically worded new constitutions and shiny new laws, it's not playing out in terms of individual rights in practice.
It reminds me of one of your interesting quotes in one of your TED talks. I mean, when you're saying everything is about sex, except sex is about power. And a lot of men and women in Egypt and in the Middle East get raped by the police in the police stations. No one gets to know exactly the account of this. No one is held accountable because it's stigmatized. People are afraid to come out and talk about it. So it's more about the marginalization of the disempowered and the overall issue of the powerlessness of the masses and the people. I mean, in the broader context. We have time for just a couple more questions. We're running out of time, but let's give chance to people who didn't.
I'm very happy to pick up on this point after the event.
Further, but anyone else? There was a hand out there. Yeah, let's see it.
Hi, thank you for your very stirring presentation. It was great. I have a quick question about the interviewees that you spoke to. If you had any sense of differences in terms of perceptions of sexual freedom among the younger generation, if you felt like they were more open, and if that crossed socioeconomic class or crossed rural-urban divide, that would be really interesting for me. Thanks.
So I need to point out that we don't yet have a McKinsey report, a Kinsey report for the Arab world. We don't have McKinsey asking these questions either. So getting a handle on what's actually happening inside bedrooms in most countries in the Arab region is extremely difficult. And that's particularly true for young people because, again, if they're unmarried, which the vast majority of, for example, young men under 30 are, you're not supposed to be asking them questions about sex. I was part of a survey group in 2009. The Population Council did a survey of young people in Egypt. We asked thousands of young people about their lives at school, at home, prospects for employment, et cetera, et cetera. We wanted to ask questions about sexual life, but the government wouldn't allow us. And this was the Mubarak regime, not their Islamist successors. And the only question we were allowed to ask is, do you know boys or girls who are having relations with boys or girls? Not a terribly informative question. The issue of sexual freedom, it's very interesting. If one looks at other polling that's been done, world values surveys, for example, what's interesting is that you often find in many countries in the region, but in particularly in Egypt, that young people actually are seemingly more conservative than their parents. And they will take a much harder line on the acceptability of premarital sex or abortion or homosexuality, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, if you talk to these young people in private, a very different reality emerges, quite frankly. And this is also the problem we have about as I said, the drive to conform, the appearance that matters so much, not so much the reality. And certainly what I found most interesting, and in particular talking to young women, is I would ask them, for example, would you like to have the freedom to have sex before marriage? And this was really brought home to me by a woman who is running a support group for divorced women in Egypt. Divorce remains highly stigmatizing in many communities. And she said to me, you know what, I don't think that sex before marriage, being able to get to know your husband in that way before marriage really makes marriages any stronger. Just look at Madonna and her many husbands. And the way that she and others defined the freedom that they wanted was certainly unmarried women were not, in my experience, asking for the freedom to have sex before marriage. Many of them are deeply religious. They believe that sex should occur within marriage. Their definition of freedom was the ability not to lose their virginity, but that their virginity should be their own business, not the family's business. It is a private matter, and that is a huge issue for not just sexual rights, but all rights in countries across our region. How can we actually operationalize our grand constitutions if individual rights don't exist, really, in practice on the ground, and family control remains very, very strong? Married women, interestingly, talked a lot about the desire for better communication with their husbands, not just inside the bedroom, but outside as well. And they're longing for romance, basically. And that's what they admired of Western sexual culture. Wasn't the freedom to have relations outside of marriage, but they thought that within marriage that there was much more equality, there was much more communication, that there was friendship, and that's what they aspired to. And in terms of the divides, in terms of socioeconomics, if we look, for instance, at the survey of young people in Egypt, we actually start to see quite an interesting convergence in attitudes between, in particular, between poorer groups, lower middle class and upper class as well, the overwhelming trend of conservatism. But again, this is what young people are saying to pollsters. And as you know, in our region, people, whether it's answering a government poll or indeed answering someone who's asking you for directions on how to get somewhere when they're in a car, people will tend to tell you what they think you want to hear.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there are so many dimensions of the issue. I mean, like the issue of sexuality, how it's framed, sexual violence, and
one final point.
Yeah.
Just one key message, which I'm trying to bring to everyone here, but also within the region, is that as we have all these, still, despite all the obstacles in Egypt, we have these aspirations to freedom and dignity and equality and justice. and we have these longings in the public sphere, we really do need to think about what is this going to look like in our private lives, and in particular, what is this going to look like in our sexual lives? Because if we do not anchor these principles in our private life, we're going to find it very difficult to achieve them in public life. We have this great rhetoric and this language and all the money and the initiatives and the efforts to empower women politically and economically and in other domains, yet if they don't have control over their own bodies, if they don't feel that they can speak to the person who is closest to them about their personal fears and desires in the bedroom, to their husband, how do we expect them to be fully engaged in the boardroom? If we say to young people, thank you, young people of Egypt, for leading us into uprising against the dictator Mubarak, but oh, you know what? We don't trust you enough to give you sexuality education or information for you to make responsible decisions in your private personal sexual lives. We need to start bridging that gap for men and for women, and that is what I hope my book will be, a tiny contribution to that much greater goal for people in the region.
Absolutely, Shereen, and I mean, it's just a pleasure. I mean, like having
thank you, Nancy, and thanks to everyone, and I'm very happy to continue the conversation.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Obviously, I mean, we're just scratching the surface, and I mean, there are so many dimensions, as I was mentioning. I mean, like, to this issue, and there is the broader issue of the deliberate attempt of the government to interfere in the private lives of people on their personal choices, not just about sexuality, but also about their religious choices and their civic arrangement choices, and how much freedom can push and expand in order to achieve that. And it's just like, I'm very, very grateful for you, Shereen, to just give us this opportunity to discuss these issues with you, and I'm sure there will be more to come, and I'm very grateful for all of you coming, and at such a short notice, just 5 days, putting this all together, and thanks to the team of Tahrir Institute for enabling this to happen. So thank you very much for this. Thank you.